Hi there, my name is David Addison, and in my last video I went through my complete iPhone RAW shooting and editing workflow, and in that video I mentioned that you might come across situations that just have too much exposure range in them for your RAW files. For example, you might find a situation where you have really dark shadows and really bright highlights and everything in between, and the RAW files just don't have enough dynamic range in them to get a good exposure. Now, if you're just coming into this video fresh and you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, I would highly recommend going back and watching my complete iPhone RAW shooting and editing workflow video, because it'll get you up to speed on what I mean when I say you have to expose for certain tones and you have to make compromises and things like that. So instead of having to make compromises in high exposure range situations, you can bracket. Now, bracket is where you take multiple photos at multiple different exposures. So one photo will be exposed for the shadows, another photo will be exposed for the highlights, one for the midtones, etc. And then you merge them all together in software later. I'm going to be using Lightroom to get a higher dynamic range photo. And it's not that difficult to do. I'm going to be doing it today on my phone, so you don't need like a really expensive camera. You don't need, you know, fancy software. Lightroom is it's for all, I think. So let's get into it. And so I'm using a Camera M today. You can use any manual camera app that allows you to shoot in RAW, that allows you to control the manual settings. And I've tried to find an area of high dynamic range today to properly demonstrate bracketing, but it's the clouds are just blanketing the landscape with like the most even, like mid-tony sort of soft light, and there's not much dynamic range around. I know the sky behind me is probably blown out, but like, yeah, there is, in terms of photography, in terms of iPhone RAW photography, I've been trying to find somewhere that's suitable for bracketing, and this is the best I could do. So I've got a really bright sky here, and I've got some kind of shadow areas down here, and I've got some clouds up there, and I've got some midtones. So this is the highest, this is the best I could do that was that had quite a decent dynamic range, and was also like, it's not a good picture, but you'll have to. What did Bain say? You'll have to imagine the dynamic range. You've probably all clicked off now. Anyway, so let's get into it. There is like a fundamental rule, or it's more like a goal that I want to discuss first, and that is all your shots should be as similar as possible. Obviously the exposure is going to change, but everything else, literally everything else, should be like identical. Now that includes image quality, so that's ISO. Your ISO should stay exactly the same. If you try and merge a low ISO photo with a high ISO photo, it doesn't work out very well. You often get patches of noise in otherwise smooth areas where the software is just, you know, it's not a good look. So keep your ISO exactly the same. Your focus. So I'm going to, in Camera M, I'm going to lock the focus just there. And also your colors. So that's your white balance. So set your focus, lock your white balance. And if you don't want to use manual focus, if you're not that confident in it, then just make sure you tap to focus in the exact same place. Also, as well, obviously, your composition. Your composition, one shot can't be here, the next shot, you know, can't be a foot to the left. The merging software is just not going to, Lightroom is just not going to merge the pictures very well if you do that. Hence the tripod. If you try and do this handheld, Lightroom can align your photos, it can auto align them, but it's always best to just keep your phone as still as possible. Right, let's get into it. There is a dog, and that kind of brings me on to my next point perfectly. That is a well-timed dog. Hello, doggy. And that is movement. So as things are moving across your scene, again, it might confuse Lightroom later. And I've got a perfect example of this, because I have taken other examples for this video where someone is moving in the scene, and Lightroom just doesn't do a very good job of kind of erasing that person from one of the photos, because that's what it has to do, right? Because otherwise you're going to get like the same person like across your scene, and at multiple different exposures as well, which can really just mess up your photo. Lightroom can account for, it can use something called deghosting, which does account for movement. It can like mask over some movements, but it's best to just avoid it all together if you can. So let's get started. Right, I'm going to come into my manual settings here. I've set my white balance, set my focus. I'm going to come into my manual settings, set my ISO as low as possible, of course, shooting in RAW. And now my first job is to expose for the midtones. So the midtones in this scene, most of them, most of the tones are midtones. So I'm just going to keep an eye on my histogram and just try and expose for the midtones as best I can. Okay, let's call that like 1/200th of a second, and let's take that photo. So that's our base photo, that's our base exposure, around which all of our other photos are going to be, not judged, but adjusted based on, exposed for based on. So let's now expose for those highlights, and we're going to adjust the shutter speed based on stops. Now a stop in photography is the doubling or halving of brightness. So if I go from 1/200th of a second to 1/100th of a second, I've halved my shutter speed, and that's one stop. If I go from 1/200th of a second to 1/400th of a second, then that is also a stop. And it's important to think in stops, because if you were to sort of like graduate up to like a real camera, if you like, they often have bracketing modes built in, and they will communicate to you in stops. If you ever use AEB, which is auto exposure bracketing, they'll often ask you to select your exposure based on stops. So it's good that you understand those. So let's use the histogram again, and now get a good exposure for those highlights in the background. So I'm going to increase my shutter speed by double, so that's one stop. There we go, just call that 1/400th. Keeping an eye on the histogram, it still looks a little bit too bright, so let's try one more stop. So that'll be a 2-stop increase. Okay, so that's 2 stops. So looking at the histogram, there's lots of shadows in the picture now, not so much in the highlights. So I'm going to take that. Don't forget my focus, my ISO, my white balance are all locked. And let's see what that picture looks like in darkroom, because camera M doesn't show me the RAW files. So you can see there that is a much better exposure on the sky in the background. And now let's expose for the shadows, which don't exist. So let's open the shutter speed, one stop. So 1/20th, you can see the highlights blowing out there, which is what they're supposed to. And I think just one stop is necessary. You don't need to under or overexpose by an equal amount of stops. So here I've overexposed by 1 stop, and I've underexposed by 2 stops. So 100th of a second, we'll take that. Now, let's have a quick look in the darkroom, the room of darkness. Yeah, okay, so the highlights are completely blown out, and we've got a good exposure there on that grass, stuff like that. Cool, so there's a bracket, that is a set of 3 bracketed photos. So let's get them all back into Lightroom, and I'll show you the process of merging them all together. Right then, welcome to the studio, and welcome to my M1 MacBook Pro and Adobe Lightroom. So let's go through these photos and merge them all together. So the ones that we took is this one. So this one was exposed for the midtones, this one was exposed for the highlights, and this one was exposed for the shadows. And if I select them all just by shift clicking, and then I press Control H on the Mac, you can right click, go to photo merge, and then choose HDR instead. And here is our bracketed result. So we have auto align on, just in case there was little tremors in the tripod or something like that, it's best to leave it on. You got auto settings. This is Adobe Lightroom making sort of some edits for us. Then we have deghosting, which is what kind of hides movement and compensates for movement. Here, let's see if we turn it on high, just for sake of demonstration. Let's see if it picks up any sort of movement. It might do down here. And if we just go on show deghost overlay, yeah, so here's all the areas where it's sort of gone in and sort of fixed the movement. And it's best to try and leave it off if you can, because it can sort of introduce some weird artifacts. So no, I'm quite happy with the result as it looks like when there's none. So we go on merge. Now Lightroom's going to merge the photos together, and here is our final HDR result. Now it has applied some edits for us, like I said. So we can bring the highlights down, bring the shadows up. There is now like a ton of dynamic range in this photo. When we come in, there's very little noise down here in the water. In fact, look at that. Can you see that? Little artifacts there caused by the movement. Those are the sort of artifacts that you wouldn't see unless you zoomed in this far. So that's what I was saying about being careful with movement, and that's what the deghosting would have picked up on as well and removed. Yeah, same here in the branches. So let's actually go back. I'm actually glad that's happened. Let's go back. Let's merge those photos again. This time with deghosting turned on. Let's turn it on high, again for sake of demonstration, and let's see what it does. So let's merge those together and compare the two photos. How exciting. Something goes wrong and it actually helps my demonstration. So select these two HDR photos, go into library, and then we can compare them. The one that was deghosted is on the right, the one that wasn't is on the left. But look at what's happened here. We have a random sort of patch of artifact noise area. It just looks horrible. And in fact, what I would do in this situation if that happened, well, one, as I said to you before, this situation wasn't the best example. I wouldn't have even bothered bracketing in the situation. But two, if this did happen on a real sort of where bracketing was necessary, you can only see it when you zoom in 300%. If this photo is going on Instagram, I wouldn't bother. No one can even see that, especially on their phone, on a screen that's like tiny. Then the picture's even tinier again. So like I can only see that because I've zoomed in 300%. Like I didn't notice that at all on the Mac screen when I was merging the pictures. So, you know, there I just wouldn't bother with deghosting. But at least you've seen now what can happen with movement and deghosting. Now let me show you a better bracketed example that I took when I was taking some test shots for this video. So this one here is, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got a sequence of 4 bracketed photos. In fact, let me get off this view. So we've got midtones, shadows, highlights, and then whites. So we can select them all, press Ctrl H, and this one contains a mistake as well, actually, with the movement. You can see down here, you can see my neighbor twice. So I'll merge them together and you'll see what I mean. So it's creating HDR. Now look at this here. There's, 300 is too much, isn't it? 100. You see, look how clean the wall is, especially relative to how dirty it should be. Look how clean everything is here. And you've also got, I can just adjust the exposure and just bring the sky back as well. Look at that. White detail. So that is the power of bracketing. But this is what can happen when you get it wrong. My neighbour's there twice. So it's obviously used in from 2 different photos. And when you deghost it, the same thing happens again. You just get patches of horrible looking noise and things like that. So yeah, just try and watch out for movement. Here, you could Photoshop him out, but you're just giving yourself a load of extra work to do. Just wait for him to disappear, you know. And you might be asking yourself, well, Dave, are these bracketed photos really that powerful? Because this has had a ton of edits done to it. Well, yes it is. So if I reset this, if I copy these edits, then reset it, you can see it looks very similar to this picture. Exposure is almost exactly the same. But I'll paste these edits on to our bracketed one. I'll paste them on to the regular photo and look at the difference. So coming into the wall here, it's just a wall of noise. Compared to the bracketed one, very, very clean. The sky, same thing with the sky. loads of detail there to play with. Whereas in the regular picture, the sky is just gone. There's no colour there whatsoever. So that's the difference between a bracketed photo and a non-bracketed photo. Just so much more dynamic range. And speaking of dynamic range, after I stopped filming in the field, the sun came out, obviously, as it would, giving me tons of dynamic range in my environment. So here I've got a sequence of 4 different photos, again taken the exact same way, based on stops of light, adjusting the settings for stops. So I've got 1 here, 2, 3 and 4, and you can see the clouds are moving. So let's see how the merge handles that. So if we select them all, press Ctrl H, it's usually quite good with clouds moving. And here is our bracketed photo. Let's merge them together. And here is our final bracketed result. Those clouds look absolutely fine. No weird artifacts like there were in the water. And if I compare, again, let's copy these edits that Lightroom has made and reset the picture. It looks very similar to this one here. Let's paste the edits in, and then come over to library, and show you the difference. So this one over here is the HDR, this one is the regular photo, and you can see just how much noisier the water is down here. This might be a 300% job, just to give you a better example. I go to 300% when it suits me. So yeah, you can see how much noisier the water is in the original shot. Same thing with this this bridge here. Just a lot more noisier. If we come into the sky is a lot noisier as well. So is the ground, the grass, the trees, the houses at the back. Just a lot noisier. And that's a better demonstration of the power of HDR and taking bracketed photos on your iPhone. So I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, there's a lot of information there. We got quite advanced at some points. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram. I'm at @pisticomao. And I'd also like to let you know I have a second YouTube channel called David Daily, which is where I've just been recording sort of more personal, still this sort of content, but a lot less set up. It's just me and my iPhone 12 Pro. I just hit record and I might be editing a photo in one video in Darkroom, I'll be editing in Lightroom, I might be creating a panorama in Lightroom, I might be editing in Final Cut Pro, I might be out shooting, you know, things like that. So if you want even more content, then go over to David Daily. I'll leave a link down in the description for you to check out. And in the meantime, David out.